see. Well, why don't we, I mean, we've sort of talked about, I think, how far is it, I don't know, what's now fair game? I think you talked to us about these different issues, equality in the family. We sort of talked about these.
But I think that,
and by death by culture, we mean basically the kind of article our class read, the Jacqueline Rose, about that if these things were happening to men, people would say it's murder.
Right.
If it happened to women, it seems to be.
And my class read excerpts from Ratna Kapoor, who you might not have noticed, but Ratna Kapoor actually appears in this. She was one of the advisors to the judges when she talks in this film. Ratna, after being very involved in the Women's Tribunal in Vienna, starts to have second thoughts and starts to worry about the exclusive attention to the state, exclusive reliance on criminal law as the response to a problem, and this victim subject. If you notice, every one of the stories that gets told at the tribunal, those were the short clips that began with, that you saw at the beginning, there were 25 stories told. Every one of them was a story of extreme violence. And within violence, every one of them is almost 2/3 of them are stories of sexual violence. So for many women's rights activists, this focus on violence, I mean, Charlotte Bunch says it clearly, it's the thing that will get the world to pay attention because it looks like torture. It's individual. It's a specific bodily harm. But this focus on violence comes with its own downside. It comes with limitations for women's human rights. And that's part of what I wanted us to think about now.
Right, and that speaks to the issue, the long historical issue of women and political equality and women and economic equality, which that little epigram I showed you at the beginning was meant to speak about, that 1% of the world's wealth is owned by women. That's astonishing.
Before the women's groups went into this Vienna tribunal, the move was for a special rapporteur on discrimination against women, who was going to look at housing, education, property ownership, access to land, inheritance. After they got together and strategized, they basically took the decision, the tactical decision, that the most compelling stories were violent stories. And they changed their claim. They changed their stories and they changed their claim. From discrimination generally to violence specifically, a rapporteur on violence alone, and a focus on sexual violence within those stories.
It's sort of fascinating. It shows the power of narrative and narrative decisions that
And when you're, I mean, part of what because I worked on this, right? So I was part of these discussions. And you watch yourself pick a winning tactic that you know is going to have downsides. But you don't know all the downsides at the time you pick it. And at the moment where you're fighting with the governments, they're stonewalling you. They're saying this is still private stuff. It's not our problem. And you think, okay, what's going to make it over? What's going to jump over and force that door open? And the stories of violence, clearly, they're this incredible moral claim. How can you not respond to stories of rape, to stories of incredible abuse and disregard by the police? It feels immoral not to respond. And so those stories work. But part of what happens, and this is particularly around this concern around sexual violence, is that becomes the essential bad thing that happens to women. All other bad things to happen to women, their failure to be part of a society that has access to information or commerce or development, drop away. And you start protecting their chastity. And part of what...
Or very 19th century, a big 19th century issue, that inheritance law. Right. That it's very difficult for married women to inherit their husband's property, which goes collaterally to his relatives and cousins, rather than the women. The women who have sweat equity in land, don't get it.
Don't get it.
Many 19th century issues are still out there that are not included by
They're not included in the violence stories. And what's interesting is there are still groups obviously working on economic questions, resource questions, global questions around inequities in health, inequities in housing, inequities in education. But they don't get the human rights moral claim attention the way the violence claims do. And for those of us who are working today on women's human rights, one of the interesting developments that I wanted to flag is in our century, this focus on the dignity of women has now been taken up by the Vatican, by the Holy See, and by the Organization of the Islamic Conference to say, we care about the dignity of women. We care that women shouldn't be raped. We just don't think that equality is the way to keep them from being raped. We're interested in protecting their dignity too. And then they talk about the dignity of women, but they're not interested in equality, access to resources. They want separate spheres for women. The Vatican will agree that women shouldn't be raped, but they will say, we don't want criminal protections. And for those of us who are also worried about the criminal law, you kind of go, you're right, sometimes the criminal law is problematic. But for many of the claims that women's groups started, they are now being used by groups that are not interested in gender equality or changing gender norms. So in the UN, the Holy See negotiates as a country. And it has an amazing international legal team. They have some of the best international lawyers in the world. And they are part of all the different debates today on sexual and reproductive rights. And they're talking about women's dignity and the protection of women from rape. And they're very interested in that story. But they're not interested in women's equality as one of the protections from rape. And so we find ourselves in these very strange moments. No, yeah.
Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
you agree.
Thank you. So how do you address the issue of protecting women's rights without violating their rights?
Meaning without so limiting their abilities? Well, that's where within...
Everyone hear the question?
Sorry.
Yes, you would.
How to address the question of protecting women's rights without violating their rights, meaning, and Ratna Kapoor used the term protectionist, which comes out of the 19th century concern. We don't want you, girls and women, to be trafficked. Lin Lap Chu's story about trafficking. The response of many governments was, okay, we'll protect you from human trafficking. We will not allow you to travel on your own, because we understand that girls and women traveling on their own are subject to being lured, deceived, otherwise without the power to safely migrate. So our way of ensuring you are not trafficked into domestic work or sexual slavery or agricultural work or begging, our way of ensuring you're not trafficked is to stop you from traveling. That actually has happened in many countries around the world. And they say it's a rights-based response. And those of us who respond to it say, it's not, because the idea is women and girls should be able to safely migrate, whether it's from their village to the capital, from the capital to another country. They need their rights to do so safely, which is a combination of economic rights, anti-racism, and a whole range of things, of which taking their visa away is not one of them.
Right.
But it's a lot harder argument to make.
Right, and the other people in the feminist community who argue that many of these age of consent laws were basically against the sexuality of women, which they sort of were. On the other hand, it did protect younger girls. So these are arguments that have been...
And they come back. I mean, part of what's interesting is the modern notion of sexual consent requires a whole lot of other equalizing practices to think that consent for a 14-year-old to say yes or no to sex is his or her right. So we have at the same time in many countries some legal people saying we want to raise the age of legal consent to sex for everybody so that girls won't be pressured into it. Some sexual rights people who are saying no, girls should be able to consent at the same age as boys and it should be lower for everyone and outside of marriage. And
that's a 19th century debate, P.S.
Right, and they are smack in the middle of the Convention on the Rights of the Child debates on sexuality. Yeah, last question.
Is women's rights really behind the customary international laws that we have?
Is women's right behind, it's our last question, is women's rights behind international human rights law or general?
Meaning, it is not yet, so sex discrimination has not yet been accepted as a violation of customary international law. The way to fight sex discrimination in the UN is to use a treaty. But it's not understood that every government in the world agrees that sex discrimination is a violation, and so it's not part of customary international law.
And we'll talk about that in our class when we talk about the Universal Declaration. Thank you.